A single letter could have changed the course of history. Deep within the Vatican's most restricted archives, a king's secret message was once delivered, its contents so volatile that admitting it existed was a risk no pope could take. This is the world of buried truths, where the most powerful alliances and the ugliest betrayals between popes and kings were deliberately scrubbed from the record. By the end of this journey, you will see the hidden machinery of power that built our world, revealed through forged documents, holy wars that were really land grabs, and captive pontiffs. What if the official story of church and state is a carefully edited version of events, and the real history is one of secret deals and erased scandals? Who do you think really gets to write history? This is where the paper trail of power leads to a fortress of silence in the heart of Rome. The Vatican Secret Archives are not merely a library, they are the ultimate vault, a physical monument to the idea that history is not what happened, but what is allowed to be remembered. Imagine a labyrinth stretching over 50 miles of shelving, a hidden city of parchment and vellum containing everything from papal decrees to private letters between pontiffs and emperors. Yet for centuries, its very name was a warning. The Latin term secretum did not mean secret as we think of it, but private, the personal property of the Pope. And what the Pope considered his private business was, by definition, nobody else's. Access is a privilege granted to a vanishingly small number of scholars, and even then, under watchful eyes. You cannot simply browse. You request a specific document from an index, a catalog that itself is a filtered version of reality. You wait, and you hope the fragile, centuries-old paper is brought to you in the sterile reading room. The overwhelming majority of those 50 miles of history have never been seen by public eyes. This is the crucial mechanism of control. It is not necessarily about burning evidence, though that has happened. It is about something more subtle and more powerful. It is about curation, by deciding what is preserved, what is cataloged in an accessible way, and what is essentially lost within the maze. The institution holds the master key to the narrative. Think of it as the world's most exclusive editing room, where the raw footage of a millennium is cut into a final, sanctioned film. Specific documents whisper of the truths held within. Take the Liber Diurnus, a medieval book of papal templates for official documents. For a long time, it was kept strictly hidden. Why? Because it showed the mundane, administrative machinery of the early papacy, including formulas for dealing with kings and confirming their power. It revealed the church as a working bureaucracy which diluted the myth of purely divine, spontaneous authority. Then there are the complete trial records of the Knights Templar. We have fragments, but the full archive of their suppression in the early 1300s, a process heavily driven by King Philip IV of France in collaboration with Pope Clement V, remains under lock and key. What deals were struck, what testimonies were coerced or destroyed to facilitate the transfer of the Templars' vast wealth to the French crown and the papacy. The full story is in that vault. This is the Pope's ultimate tool in the long dance with kings. When a monarch sent a desperate, compromising letter, as our opening story suggested, its fate was decided here. It could be filed away, a hidden lever for future influence. It could be annotated with a private papal remark, creating a secret history alongside the public one. Or it could be placed in a section so obscure it functionally ceased to exist. Every time a scholar is denied access to a specific registry or finds a reference to a document that cannot be located, the shape of history is quietly sculpted. The archive is not just a repository, it is an active participant. It answers the question of who writes history by demonstrating, stone wall by stone wall, that those who control the past control the story of power itself. And sometimes the most telling truth is not in a dramatic confession, but in an empty space on a shelf where something momentous was meant to be. But how do you create a buried truth in the first place? Sometimes it is not about hiding a real document, but about crafting a perfect fake and planting it deep within the sacred record. The most audacious example began not with a secret, but with a spectacular public claim. In the middle of the 8th century, a document surfaced that would reshape Europe for over 700 years. It was called the Donation of Constantine. Its story was breathtaking. It claimed to be a legal decree from the first Christian Roman emperor, Constantine the Great, written in the 4th century. In it, a grateful Constantine, supposedly cured of leprosy by Pope Sylvester I, made an unbelievable gift. He granted the Pope and his successors not just spiritual leadership, but temporal, political dominion over the city of Rome, all of Italy, and the entire western half of the Roman Empire. Imagine the power of that claim. For centuries, popes could point to this ancient imperial charter and say to any king or emperor who challenged them, "You rule because we allow it. Your crown is subject to our authority because the greatest emperor in history willed it so." This forged piece of parchment became the legal bedrock for the Papal States, a swath of central Italy ruled directly by the Pope. It was the ultimate trump card in political disputes, cited repeatedly to assert supremacy over worldly rulers. It was a buried truth not because it was hidden, but because its fraudulent origins were so carefully concealed by the sheer weight of tradition and authority. The genius of the forgery was in its timing. It emerged precisely when the Papacy, vulnerable to Lombard invaders in Italy, needed a powerful protector and a legal basis for its own earthly power. The document provided both, helping to forge an alliance with the Frankish king Pepin the Short, whose son would become Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor. The cycle was self-perpetuating. A king's power was legitimized by the Pope, and the Pope's power was legitimized by the forged donation from an ancient emperor. The truth was buried under layers of political necessity and sacred awe, yet like any good mystery, the cracks began to show. During the Renaissance, a scholar named Lorenzo Valla, armed not with faith but with a deep knowledge of classical Latin, took a forensic look at the text. His analysis was devastating. He exposed anachronisms that would be like finding a reference to a smartphone in a Shakespeare play. The Latin used was not the elegant, 4th century style of Constantine's court, but a later medieval form. It mentioned Constantinople as a patriarchate, a title that did not exist in Constantine's time. It referenced imperial robes and symbols that were centuries out of place. Valla proved beyond reasonable doubt that the document was a fabrication from a much later era, likely the 8th century. His work was a bombshell, but the Church did not suddenly recant. Why would it? The donation had been the foundation for too much real-world power for too long. To admit it was a forgery was to unravel the legal justification for the Papal States and to undermine the Papacy's historical claim to supremacy over kings. The truth was known in scholarly circles, but officially it remained a buried truth, a quiet embarrassment for generations more. The document's potency only faded as the world changed and the Church's temporal power waned. This story reveals a profound mechanism of control. A buried truth is not always a dark secret. It can be a brilliant fiction, elevated to sacred fact and protected by the very institutions it empowers. The donation of Constantine shows that sometimes the most powerful buried truths are the ones everyone can see, but no one in power dares to question because the entire architecture of authority is built upon their shaky ground. The donation of Constantine was a fiction that built an empire, but sometimes the buried truth is a violent reality disguised as holy virtue. Take the sun-drenched hills of southern France in the early 13th century, a region known as Languedoc, where a vibrant culture thrived with its own language, the Languedoc, or Occitan. Here, a religious movement called Catharism took root, challenging the very foundations of the Catholic Church with its belief in two gods, one good and one evil, and rejecting the material world. To Pope Innocent III, this was not just heresy, it was an existential threat to his authority, but his solution reveals a darker, buried truth. This was not merely a war for souls, it was a land grab, a brutal expansion sanctioned by the highest spiritual power. The Pope needed a military force to crush the heresy, but he had no army of his own. The northern French king, Philip II, had a powerful army and ambitions to expand his royal domain, but he needed a righteous cause, a legal and moral cover to invade the lands of his own vassals in the south. A quiet deal was struck, though no single document may ever prove it. The Pope declared a crusade, offering the same full remission of sins, the same spiritual rewards, as a journey to Jerusalem. But he added a crucial earthly incentive: the lands and titles of any noble who protected the Cathars, or who was simply accused of doing so, would be forfeit and given to any northern knight who could seize them. The message was unmistakable: God wills your conquest, and you will be paid in territory. The war that followed, the Albigensian Crusade, was one of the most savage in medieval history. It began with a horrific signature event at the city of Béziers in July of 1209. When the Crusader army arrived, the local Catholic citizens refused to hand over their Cathar neighbors. The military commander, asked how to tell heretic from faithful, reportedly gave a chilling order: kill them all, God will know his own. The city was stormed, and an estimated 20,000 men, women, and children were slaughtered in the streets and churches. This was not a battle, it was a terror tactic, a message written in blood to the entire region about the cost of resistance. For 20 years, the war ground on, a campaign of siege and massacre that had little to do with nuanced theology and everything to do with power. Northern French barons like Simon de Montfort carved out new fiefdoms for themselves from the ruins of Occitan castles. The independent, courtly culture of the South was systematically dismantled, its language suppressed, its nobles dispossessed. By the time the Treaty of Paris ended the conflict in 1229, the wealthy Languedoc region was effectively annexed to the French crown. The heresy was crushed, but so was a way of life. So where is the buried truth? It lies in the seamless fusion of spiritual and political motives. Officially, the chronicles speak of a holy pope defending the faith against a dangerous heresy. And that was true as far as it went, but the unspoken, buried layer is that the Pope provided the moral and legal framework for a king's territorial ambition. The Crusade indulgence was the ultimate blank check, absolving warriors of any sin committed in the pursuit of this goal. The Pope got a purified church, and the king got a unified kingdom. The vibrant Occitan culture was the collateral damage, its suppression not an unfortunate side effect, but the very point of the exercise. This successful buried truth set a terrible precedent. It proved that a papal decree could turn a political conquest into a sacred duty, laundering violence through divine approval. The alliance between the throne and the altar was never more clear or more devastating than when the cross on a soldier's tunic was also the flag of a royal annexation. That alliance between cross and crown could become a cage. In the 14th century, the dance of power took a shocking turn, a reversal so complete it shattered the very idea of papal independence. For nearly 70 years, the seat of the Catholic Church was not in Rome, but in the fortified city of Avignon on the banks of the Rhone River in southern France. History calls it the Babylonian Captivity of the Papacy, a name that echoes the ancient exile of the Jews, and for good reason. This was not a voluntary retreat or a strategic relocation. It was the result of a king so powerful, so ruthless, that he broke the spiritual leader of Christendom and moved the entire papal court to his backyard. The man who engineered this was Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair for his blonde hair and cold, calculating nature. His conflict with the previous pope, Boniface VIII, had been a brutal clash of egos and ideologies. Boniface had issued a famous bull, a formal decree, stating that it was absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff. In other words, kings answered to popes, not the other way around. Philip responded not with theology, but with raw power. He sent his agents to Italy, where they stormed the pope's summer palace at Anagni, physically assaulting the 86-year-old Boniface. The pope was slapped, allegedly, and held captive for 3 days before local townspeople freed him. He died of shock and humiliation a month later. This was the prelude, a demonstration that a king could lay hands on God's vicar on earth and face no divine retribution. The message was received. Philip needed a pope he could control, not one who would challenge him. After a brief, compliant pontiff died, Philip leveraged his influence to ensure the election of a French cardinal who became Clement V. And then, under constant pressure and likely for his own safety amid the chaotic Italian political landscape, Clement never went to Rome. He moved the papal court to Avignon in 1305, beginning a 70-year exile. The buried truth here is profound. The papacy did not just move to France, it became an instrument of French royal policy. For 7 decades, a succession of French popes and their overwhelmingly French cardinals lived in a magnificent palace fortress, a gilded cage funded by unprecedented church taxation. They centralized the church's financial bureaucracy here, creating a machine that efficiently collected revenues from across Europe, much of which flowed into French coffers or funded French interests. Imagine the symbolism. For centuries, popes had summoned kings to Rome to kneel before them. Now, the pope looked out his window at the Rhone, a river in the Kingdom of France. Ambassadors from other monarchs, from England or the German states, had to travel to French territory to plead their cases. Every papal decision, every appointment of a bishop, every grant of funds was now viewed through the lens of French advantage. The spiritual leader of all Christendom had become, in the eyes of many, a chaplain to the French king. The damage to the church's authority was catastrophic. The poet Petrarch, who lived in Avignon, called it the wicked Babylon, a sink of vice and corruption where spirituality was suffocated by politics and luxury. Across Europe, faithful Christians grew disillusioned. How could the Pope be the impartial father of all when he lived under the shadow of the French crown? This loss of spiritual credibility was the direct fuse for the explosion that followed. When the papacy finally returned to Rome in 1377, the French cardinals, accustomed to their power and lifestyle, rejected the Italian Pope. They elected a rival pope of their own who set up court back in Avignon. For 40 years, there were 2, and at one point 3, men claiming to be the true vicar of Christ, each excommunicating the other's followers. This was the Western Schism, a crisis of legitimacy that tore the church apart, and it was born directly from the buried truth of Avignon. The king's power play had not just captured a pope, it had fractured the very institution, proving that when spiritual authority becomes a political tool, the foundation of faith itself can crumble. The pattern is now unmistakable. Across centuries, the buried truth is rarely a simple secret, but a transaction. It is a quiet trade between a throne and an altar, where spiritual authority is bartered for military force, and divine blessing is exchanged for earthly dominion. A forged document creates legal territory out of thin air. A crusade for souls conveniently annexes a kingdom. A captive pope in a gilded palace funnels the wealth of Christendom into a single royal treasury. These were not isolated scandals, but the hidden machinery that built the map of Europe and defined the very contours of faith itself. Every time a pope needed an army, a king found his conquest sanctified. Every time a king needed legitimacy, a pope provided the Holy Seal. The losers in these deals were not just rival nobles or heretical believers, but entire cultures, languages, and alternative versions of history that were systematically erased. This leaves us with one final, haunting question. If the victors, the popes and kings in their alliance, were the ones who buried these truths, what stories did the losers try to tell? What chronicles were burned in the sieges of Occitania? What letters from disgraced Templars were tossed into the fire? What accounts of that day at Annexing, written by the townspeople who freed a humiliated pope, have been lost to time? To engage with history is to become a detective of silence. It means listening as carefully for what is not said as for what is proclaimed. It means looking for the empty spaces on the archive shelf, the curiously missing witness, the official story that feels a little too clean, a little too convenient for those in power. So we turn the question to you. After this journey through forged charters and holy wars, which of these buried truths struck you as the most shocking? Was it the sheer audacity of the donation of Constantine, the brutal calculus of the Albigensian Crusade, or the profound captivity of the Avignon Papacy? Share your thoughts in the comments below. and let us know what other historical mysteries we should investigate next. If you enjoyed this dive into the shadows of power, subscribe for more episodes where we piece together the puzzles of the past. Remember, history is never just a story we are told. It is an argument, a constant negotiation over what happened and what it means. And for a very long time, the popes and the kings made sure they were the ones who got the last word.